generally, people thought it went well?
That was the bus.
Good.
The bus actually worked.
Were there any logistical issues this time with buses and hotels? No, it went pretty well. Good to hear. That's what Matthias passed on to me, but I need to hear it from the horse's mouths. Okay, we'll crack on. This is a wonderful story. I've only been able to tell a small bit of it in the talk this evening. I mean, Sky Warriors, the book, of course, is about the whole of the British Airborne story, the British Airborne experiment, as it was known in the early days from 1940 to 1945. It still astonishes me, having recently visited the 16 Air Assault Brigade's headquarters, where I gave a talk, but also had a little look at their history there. And to this day, they still have the moment when Churchill said to have asked for the raising of the 5,000 paratroopers on the 22nd of June. This is partly because a number of history books have mistakenly thought that was the opening moment. It was, of course, the 5th of June. I'll come back to that in a moment. We're going to start with this slide. It is a Whitley bomber turning a horse a glider, and I'm just going to read out an extract from a rather dramatic moment of the story of D-Day. And that will illustrate it for you. As the huge plywood and steel glider, 67 feet in length and with a wingspan of 88 feet, began its final descent to the target, all that could be heard was air swishing down the fuselage and the co-pilot, John Ainsworth, counting down the seconds on his stopwatch, lit by a small handheld lamp, before instructing pilot Jim Woolwork to turn 90 degrees to starboard. The second of these turns brought the glider onto a northerly heading, and directly ahead, clearly visible by moonlight, was the familiar outline of the Caen Canal Bridge that the pilots knew so well from the detailed model. Quick look here at the map will orientate you, I think. Glider number 1, which we're following into the target, is coming in from a southerly bearing. The 3 gliders coming that way and 3 gliders coming that way. I'll explain why in a moment, but I'm sure all of you can imagine why they're having to come on a slightly different bearing. Behind them, that is behind the pilots, the 5 sappers and 23 officers and men of D Company, 2nd Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, were silent, each man thinking of what was to come and those he had left behind. You might think I'm making this up, mightn't you? This is a bit novelistic. Well, this is what John Howard claims he was thinking at this point, and not just him. Howard, of course, the great hero of the story, here he is. Howard had visions of his wife Joy and 2 children sleeping peacefully in their beds in Oxford, and could feel the small lump in his tunic's breast pocket where he had placed one of his son's first pairs of red leather shoes. Out of the open door he could see the River Orne and knew they were on course. With the glider losing height rapidly and rocking from side to side, Ainsworth yelled, "Hold tight." It was the signal for the men to adopt the brace position by linking arms and lifting their legs off the floor. Gripping their weapons tightly, the men tensed their bodies for impact. I gritted my teeth, recalled Howard, and tried to pray, but all I could think of was, please God, as we came into land with a terrific crash, a splintering noise, and sparks flying past the outside doorway. Skidding and bouncing twice on the uneven ground, the glider lost its wheels and landed on its metal skids at 80 miles per hour. Howard thought they were under fire, but in fact the flashes were just caused by the skids striking the stony ground. With a final thunderous roar, the glider came to a juddering halt with its nose through the bridge's barbed wire defences, just as Howard had requested. This is where it came to rest, glider number 1, followed in literally a minute or 2 later by glider number 2 and glider number 3. Here's the bridge. There's the famous water tower on the bridge. That's the defensive positions you can see there. I mean, it's absolutely perfect landing. This is all done at night, don't forget. Astonishing bit of flying that I think Lee Mallory, who of course was in overall charge of the RAF effort at D-Day, said was some of the finest flying at the whole of the Second World War. And these are glider pilots, remember. They are not members of the RAF, they're glider pilot regiment, just to stress that. And they're also effectively soldiers, so once they're on the ground, they're expected to take part and fight with the rest of the airborne troops. The time, 12:16 a.m. on Tuesday, 6th of June 1944, and the D-Day landings had begun. This is the spearhead of the D-Day landings. Howard's glider, number 1 glider, was the vanguard of what was known as Operation Tonga, which was the airborne component, or at least the British airborne component, of Overlord. We know about Overlord, the extraordinary effort to use 5,300 ships and 12,000 aircraft to land or drop 150,000 men and 1,500 tanks on or behind 5 beaches in Normandy, northern France. Tonga, the British bit, required the insertion of 8,500 glider and paratroopers on the eastern flank. I mean, it's interesting. So you get 2 US divisions, the 82nd and the 101st, and they are assigned to the western flank, which is not the most dangerous flank, I hope for obvious reasons, because the open flank is the flank that leads into the interior of France, and that's the eastern flank. And that was assigned to 6th Airborne Division, which of course was smaller than the combined US Airborne Division. So why was that? Mainly because it was more experienced. And you'll also notice at Arnhem, and feel free to ask me about Arnhem if you would like in the questions segment. Again, British Airborne, 1st Airborne Division in that instance also gets the toughest job to take the bridge furthest away from the ground troops. At the same time, 13,000 men of the 2 US Airborne Divisions will secure the western flank. The 6th Airborne had 4 key objectives. The single most important objective was to capture that bridge and the neighbouring Orne River Bridge. So they have been landed between those 2 bridges, as you can see from the map here. You've got Caen Canal Bridge there, Orne River Bridge there. They're landing in those 2 sections there. Speed is the essence. They've got to capture those bridges as quickly as possible and hold them for 2 reasons, mainly to prevent a German counterattack, particularly an armoured counterattack. They know the 21st Panzer Division is in the vicinity. But it's also, ultimately, if they can hold the bridgehead for long enough, the airborne bridgehead that is, will enable Allied troops to break out of the bridgehead too. There are a couple of other key objectives. Generally speaking, I'm just talking, of course, initially by about 180 men of the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry and the sappers who were with them. But of course, there's another 8,500 coming in, and their job is to control or at least secure a bridgehead, an airborne bridgehead, between the Orne River, and if you go further east from there to the Dives River and the various important bits of high ground in between. They never actually managed to control all of that, as we're going to discover, but that's the plan. There's another important, absolutely vital bit to the story, and that's the neutralization of the Mayerville battery, and we'll come on to that. I mean, for obvious reasons, if you've got heavy guns, 4 heavy guns sighted so that they can interdict the landings at Salt Beach, you've got a problem, and they need to knock that out. So that's a job given to someone else, and we'll come on to that story when we get there. Howard, a fascinating character. I mean, the man given the job of carrying out the operation. Let's get back to Howard. Extraordinary character. He comes from a very modest background, 2 up, 2 down, born in Camden, North London. Educated until he was 14, then leaves school, becomes a shipping clerk, loses his job, and then joins both the police force and the army as an ordinary bloke. I mean, obviously you would in the police force, but in the army he joins as an other rank, works his way up to NCO, senior NCO, regimental sergeant major, and that drive and that sort of feeling that he wasn't a typical army officer, particularly in the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, which is quite a smart regiment, as some of you will know. It's kind of history going all the way back to Waterloo. The 52nd Light Infantry plays an absolutely key role in the winning of the Battle of Waterloo. And there are a lot of quite well-heeled, typical upper middle class officers in the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry, and Howard is not one of them. I'll come on to the training and the thought process about Howard in a minute, because it's a great story. But just to go back for a second to the start of the story, to give you a little bit of context, that date that I briefly mentioned at the start, 5th of June 1940, when Churchill asked for, and here's the quote, the raising of parachute troops on a scale equal to 5,000, as in his mind a way of taking the fight to the Nazis, who of course have just kicked the British out. We've just escaped with the skin of our teeth from Dunkirk. France is still fighting, the French are still fighting, but everybody knows they're not going to last that long. The best we can hope for is that the French government is going to fight on, possibly from North Africa. That's really all we can hope for. Churchill is sending troops over to the so-called second BEF to try and stiffen the French, but this is really a gesture. He knows they're not going to be able to keep the Germans at bay. So he's thinking longer term, and people have often argued, well, commandos, paras, do we really need them? There was a lot of opposition, of course, from the traditional types in the military at that stage, and there was also a lot of opposition, certainly against airborne, from the RAF, for I hope obvious reasons. The RAF's main interest at this time was strategic bombing, and they had no resources designed, of course, for airborne forces, because we didn't have any airborne forces. The Germans did, the Russians did, the Italians did, the French did for a bit, even the Belgians, I was told by a former Belgian paratrooper the other day, but the British did not, and therefore we had to start absolutely from scratch, and that meant we had to beg, steal, and borrow equipment. We even had to design new parachutes. Everybody was learning on the job. It was really basic stuff. We were chatting at the beginning, I was chatting at the beginning to someone, and he was mentioning the fact, absolutely true, that the original drops were out of converted bombers. They literally just cut a hole in the floor, and I'll show you a picture of a couple of them. Here's Boyd Browning. I mean, he plays an important story. We'll come on to Browning in a second. Here they are, a stick of early parachute troops, early 1941, so this is just 6 months into the experiment, boarding a Whitley bomber, and they would have jumped out of a hole in the floor. The initial operation, Operation Colossus, don't have time to talk about it, takes place in February 1941 in Italy, exactly the same thing. It's 36 guys from X-Troop of what would become the 1st Parachute Battalion drop out of a hole in the floor. This takes time, of course. It's not an ideal way to get out of a plane. That operation was reasonably successful, but everyone was captured, so 100% casualties. It depends what you mean by successful. But for Churchill's absolutely unwavering determination and support for the airborne experiment, it probably wouldn't have properly got off the ground. He wanted 5,000. The initial total that he was lucky to get was 500, which was a battalion, and it was going to take a considerable period of time before he got up to speed, mainly because of this inter-service rivalry. Errors were made, they didn't have the right kit. You can imagine the usual stories, but Churchill realized there was going to be a psychological element to the creation of airborne troops that was going to be really significant. It's not just the material effect, it's the moral effect too. The psychological effect for Britain to have some of these operations. So Operation Colossus, which I referred to briefly, which was the knocking out of an aqueduct in southern Italy in the hope that we're going to destroy the kind of water supply for the whole of the province of Apulia, and that's going to mean that the various ports in Apulia, these very important ports in Apulia, aren't going to be able to operate. I mean, you can see what they were thinking, a bit optimistic, but they did manage to break the aqueduct and therefore sever the water supply, not for long. That was the problem. It was far too ambitious. But this was a tremendous fillip to the Brits when they heard about this. This was reported, unlike some of the special operations which I referred to before. And it did make a hell of a difference. And it also had an effect on the Italians, who thought, hold on a second, these guys can come from anywhere at any time by air, and therefore we need to be ready for them. So they're kind of distributing their defensive troops all over the place, just like they were with the coast. I'm sure I mentioned before with the SBS attacking the coast of Italy. Exactly the same principle. So you have far more effect with even a relatively small number of people in terms of unhinging the enemy, unbalancing the enemy. And I think it was Montgomery who said many years later, actually, one of the great advantages of airborne troops, and he, by the way, was a great fan of airborne troops, which you may or may not be surprised to hear, even after Arnhem. His argument was they're as valuable when they're not used as when they are. In other words, you keep them ready to go, particularly in large formations, so divisions, and the enemy doesn't know when you're going to use them, and therefore it has to, defend everywhere, as it were. It has to be on its toes everywhere, and this is difficult. I mean, you got this moment in the early part of Sky Warrior's book. I talk about the psychological fear in Britain of a paratroop landing. This was something that, has been replayed, I know, in popular culture in Dad's Army, but it was absolutely the case. And Dad's Army, the original force that was created, this volunteer force that was created, their original nickname was parachutists. In other words, they're going to shoot the German paratroopers as they come down. Now, the Germans, of course, had used airborne forces in the Low Countries relatively successfully in some places, Abenamel, of course, the famous glider operation, but not so successful in others, in particular in Holland. And yet the overall effect was to convince Churchill that this was a potential war-winning bit of kit, and therefore that was one of the additional factors in getting him interested. He had been interested in planes and paratroopers for a long time, actually. I was surprised to read that. From many years before. He had that sort of fertile imagination, didn't he, Churchill? Always thinking of ways to do things differently and not always getting it right. They're used in lots and lots of different ways. I've just got a quick picture of Arnhem here. 3 ways in the end, very simply. I mean, it's probably oversimplification, airborne troops in the Second World War. One, as a raiding force. That was what they were originally designed to do, and that's what they were originally designed to do at places like Colossus, as I mentioned, but also Operation Biting, that very successful capture of German radar at the beginning of 1942 really had a proper effect. And yet, it's a relatively small number of guys go in there. John Frost, of course, who comes into the story at Arnhem, leads a company, C Company of the 2nd Parachute Battalion. And it's very successful, but it's smallish scale. I was wondering whether we should get the cat or one. We've got any Scots in the room? We probably have got one too. It reminds me of getting married, actually. I think it's the last time I enjoyed the sound of the pipes. Getting back to the point. So originally as a raiding force, and then incidentally, not by design, used as traditional infantry. So in North Africa, for example, where the original 1st Parachute Brigade broken up into 3 parachute battalions, or at least it drops as 3 separate parachute battalions. All 3 of those battalions eventually fight as just ground forces. And this, I would argue, and I mean, it's not a terribly sophisticated argument, is a tremendous waste of very effective troops who have been trained to a high standard. They're aggressive. They are taught to do everything at speed. They're relatively lightly equipped, of course, because they come by air. And to actually expect them to fight as ground infantry is a waste. And of course, a lot of them lose their lives in North Africa. But they do tremendously well. If you look at the eulogies from the brigade commanders, the divisional commanders, and the corps commanders who have them under their control, they think they've died and gone to heaven, because they are as redoubtable in attack as they are in defense. So they are very, very effective ground troops. But the third and most important role, and one that Churchill very quickly got his head round, but really was the responsibility of this man, if I can come to him, hold on, I've gone past him, often much maligned, Frederick Boyd Browning. Now, Boyd Browning doesn't come well out of the Arnhem story. We don't have time to go through the beats of Arnhem here, but as I say, feel free to talk about it or to ask me questions about it. But Boyd Browning played an absolutely key role in the airborne experiment, getting the brigade up to divisional strength. He was the 1st commander of the 1st Airborne Division. Former guardsman, really knew nothing about planes, knew nothing about either planes or airborne troops, and yet got the potential use of airborne forces in a large scale. And that's in a strategic sense. So you drop at least a division, I mean, minimum a brigade, but then possibly a division at a location or close to a location where it takes things like bridges and airfields and other vital targets, vital bits of infrastructure, in coordination with a ground attack. So just think Arnhem, but also think D-Day. Now, the reason there's this problem with Arnhem, as we all know, is they make 2 very, very basic errors. There were reasons why they made them, by the way. They knew they were potential errors, but they did it anyway. They dropped the airborne forces too far away from the actual target, first problem. But the second and arguably even more serious problem was the distance the ground forces had to go to relieve them, because obviously anything can happen in that interim. So you close that gap, you make sure you drop them very close to the target, and all of a sudden you've got one of the most successful operations of the Second World War arguably the most successful operation, and that's Operation Varsity, which was the crossing of the Rhine. Not often spoken about, actually. Again, feel free to talk about that. Right, let's go back to Howard, and let's go back to the story of Airborne. It's worth reminding everyone in this room that the formation chosen for this crucial role on D-Day, the single most important role on D-Day, was given to the 6th Airborne Division, which had not been in action up to this point. Bit of a risk. And yet, quite cleverly, they made sure that a number of veteran officers from the 1st Airborne Division were moved across to the 6th Airborne Division. One who plays an absolutely key role in the story of the bridges, which we'll come to in a moment, had commanded 3 para in North Africa, so he was a veteran of the 1st Airborne Division. Howard and his lot were not paratroopers, of course, they were glider-borne troops, Ox and Bucks Light Infantry. I mentioned a little bit before about Howard's background. The reason he was chosen, the reason his company was chosen for this absolutely crucial role is because he had turned his company into the finest trained and motivated company in the whole of the 6th Air Landing Brigade. So the 6th Airborne Division, in a nutshell, I know I'm missing out all the other vital arms, which of course is medicine, engineers, artillery, much to the fury of anyone in this room who comes to one of those arms. But you've got the teeth of the division are 2 parachute brigades and an air landing brigade. And of course the Ox and Bucks come from the 6th Air Landing Brigade. They're only using a single company, reinforced company, to carry out this vital role. Howard, said one of his men, was proud of having come up from the ranks to achieve his position, having once been an Oxford City police sergeant, and he took his responsibilities very seriously indeed. This meant that his company had to be the best at everything, be it sport, marches, field exercises, or physical and endurance training, and it was. He is undoubtedly, I mean, he admits this himself in his memoirs, was partly driven by the snobbery of the unit and the feeling that he was being looked down upon, and a determination to do everything better than all his fellow officers, and he did. So he's chosen by his battalion commander, who of course knows, who's best at the job, to carry out this vital role. Your company, says his commanding officer, will be the spearhead for the invasion. I feel absolutely confident you will be able to pull it off. And he was right to be confident. No, over the next month, so it's interesting, that takes place on the 15th of April. That's the first Howard hears about his role. So he's got 6 weeks basically to get up to speed. And to devise the plan, and a very effective plan it is, because he knows he can't take that many troops on this mission. The more gliders that they use, the easier it is for the Germans that realize they're coming. It's going to be a small, compact force. You use gliders for an operation of this type rather than parachutists, because you can land a group of people all in one place together, if they get to the right place. Not all of them are going to get to the right place, but also silently. If you think of the problem with paratroopers, they have to be dropped reasonably close to where they're going to come down onto the ground, and you can hear the planes dropping them. With a glider, they get released a fair distance away, and there's absolutely no way, unless you're literally looking up at the sky, as they're coming into land, you're going to know they're arriving, which is exactly what happens in the early hours of the 6th of June. Howard has devised a very clever plan. You can see the map there again. He's got 3 gliders coming in from the north and 3 in from the south. Each of those groups of gliders has a separate target. So the ones coming in from the south are going to take the Caen Canal Bridge, and the other 3 are going to take the Orne River Bridge. The problem is, you've got 2 commanders of these 2 mini forces. Howard is going to command one, and his deputy, his deputy company commander, Brian Priday, is going to command the other one. The problem is, Brian Priday's glider goes missing. We'll come on to that. Therefore, but going back to the plan, he's rehearsed it, he's got aerial photographs, he's got all the intelligence, they built a model to scale. They're changing the detail on the model as information is coming in from intelligence, particularly from the resistance, who are giving some absolutely vital information on how many Germans there are there and what the defences are like, what sort of kit they've got there. The general feeling is that the German troops are of a pretty low quality. I think they underestimated them a little bit, I have to say. But the real threat they've got, as I've already mentioned before, is going to come from the 21st Panzer Division and how quickly it's going to react. We'll come on to that. So here they are, they've landed at, I say land, I mean gliders don't really land, or they certainly don't land at night, they crash. And that's exactly what happens. And Howard himself is knocked unconscious briefly. The two glider pilots very badly knocked about. They're at the front of the glider, and everyone else is a little bit shaken. And yet they've got to react immediately. So the first thing that Howard feels is or sees is nothing. It's just darkness in front of him, and he thinks he's had a heavy blow to his head. He thinks there's a problem with his eyes. Actually, the bowler helmet's come down over his eyes, and when he pushes it back up, great, okay? And he can also see very, very close. As soon as he rolls out of the glider, he can see he's right on the target, and this is absolutely brilliant news. So he orders his his platoon commander, Den Brotheridge, commanding the 1st platoon, whose job it is to go over, get across the bridge as quickly as possible. So in a nutshell, the tactics are, 1st platoon gets over the bridge and takes the other side. They, as you can see from the map, they're on the inside of both of these bridges. You've got to capture both sides of the bridge. Again, Arnhem, they never managed to capture the south of Arnhem Bridge. This is going to be a problem, it was a problem. But in this particular case, Brotheridge's job is to get across the bridge. Howard rolls out with his Sten gun, a bit shaken, you know, dust everywhere, sees the target and tells Brotheridge to get cracking. So Brotheridge gets his platoon on the move. Each section's got a separate job. And the other thing I should have mentioned is that 3 platoons are given the job of capturing each bridge. Each of them is assigned a specific job. But they all know that if anything goes wrong, i.e. anyone goes missing, they can do everyone else's job. So they're all trained in these multiple different tasks. But the good news is all 3 platoons have landed very close to what will become known, of course, as Pegasus Bridge, and therefore they're immediately into action. Brotheridge races across the bridge at the head of his troops. Here's the direction he went, straight under the water tower and across the other side. This is the famous Gondry Cafe. Benouville, the village, is just behind that. Defensive positions here and defensive positions on the other side. So their job is to clear them as quickly as possible. Sadly, Brotheridge gets shot through the throat as he's approaching the Gondry Cafe and he's mortally wounded. But it's amazing how few people are actually killed in this action. There's a lot of firing. There's a German sentry on the bridge as they're going across. He fires very light, realizing they're under fire, and then Scarpers, and they're all, of course, firing their Sten guns from the hip as they're running across the bridge. The main reason they have to get over the other side of the bridge as quickly as possible is to secure it and stop the Germans from blowing it. They do actually have, not the Ox and Bucks, but the 7th Para, we'll come back to them, or we'll come on to them in a moment, who play an absolutely vital role in the defense of the bridge. 7th Para actually has with it, when it drops, a number of boats, inflatables, to get across the river in case the bridge is blown. But in truth, if that bridge gets blown, that is a bit of a problem. Now, of course, on the one hand, it's stopping the Germans from going across it, which is why they don't want to do it unless they really have to. But on the other hand, it's severing the communications, of course, with the beaches, with Sword Beach, which is on the far side of the Pont Canal. Here's a nice quote from Dennis Edwards, who was also with Brotheridge. He's with the first section across. As we near the far side of the bridge, still shouting, firing our weapons and lobbing hand grenades, the Germans jumped to their feet and ran for their lives, scattering in all directions. Relief, exhilaration, incredulity. I experienced all these feelings upon realizing that we had taken the bridge. It's happened incredibly quickly. They are now clearing. Don't think this is the end of the fight. There's a lot of casualties that are being incurred as they're now clearing out the inner defences, which they bypassed. And meanwhile, exactly the same thing's going on the other bridge. It's no good capturing just one of these bridges. You've got to capture both of them. Here's the Orne River Bridge. It's actually a much longer bridge, and that picture says 1,000 words. There's only a single glider in the frame there. Where are the other 2? Well, number 4's gone missing. I already mentioned that with Priday. It's actually landed near to the Dive River, which is about 8 or 9 miles away, maybe even more actually, and it's out of the game. Most of the land in between is flooded, and they're going to take all day to get back to base, so to speak. So you've just got 2 gliders left. One of them, which you can see, is number 6 glider. So its job is really to reinforce the other 2 platoons. They've gone missing. Number 5 glider is actually about 3/4 of a mile back. It's landed too soon in a field a fair way away, and they're going to be making their way to the bridge, but of course speed is of the essence. So number 6 platoon, whose job really was to clear up and help out, now has the absolutely key role, and because, as I've already explained, they're all trained to do everyone else's job. It does it very effectively. There's one particularly heroic bit of action carried out by a man who's going to become one of the great heroes of the story, actually. Here he is, Wagger Thornton, who uses he's a sergeant, as you can see. He uses a mortar bomb to land directly into a German machine gun post. And it's not as heavily defended as the Caen Canal Bridge. And within a very short period of time, they've taken the bridge, they've sent a message to Howard at the other bridge, we've got the bridge. And he then sends out, of course, that famous signal, ham and jam, ham and jam, ham and jam. This is the code word for we've got both bridges. Only the problem is it wasn't heard by anyone, because the man who was supposed to receive it, the Brigadier Poet, has become separated from his radio operator. They're coming in by parachute. He's commanding the, I think it's the 3rd Parachute Brigade, the 3rd or the 5th. And therefore he never receives it. But it doesn't matter. They've captured both of these bridges. You've now got a brief hiatus where they're waiting to see what happens next. Now the plan was for 7th Parachute Battalion, once it's landed to the west of the, once it's landed to the east of the Orne River, so it's landing in that airborne bridgehead between the Orne River and the Dives River. Once it's got to its rendezvous point, once its men have got to the rendezvous point, they're to march immediately for the bridges and act as a kind of defensive force. The problem is, as happened all over D-Day, both to the Americans and to the British, for lots of different reasons. Eureka beacons aren't working very effectively, pilots are inexperienced and ill-trained, and the weather, of course. People are dropped all over the place, and the parachuters in particular are blown here, there, and everywhere. And when the 7th Parachute Battalion, whose job is, as I say, to get to the bridges as quickly as possible, finally manages to concentrate, there are only 150 of them out of 600. But that's, nevertheless, that's enough for them to be getting on with. So they march straight for the bridge, but they don't get there until an hour and a half after they should have arrived. In this window, it could have been a disaster if the Germans had reacted as rapidly as they should have done. And as von Luck, who is famous Panzer commander, wrote a memoir which I'm sure some of you are familiar with, always described himself as Rommel's favourite Panzer leader. He commanded initially in the 7th Parachute, the 7th Panzer Division, so he'd been with Rommel for that long. He was an officer in the reconnaissance battalion, and later on, during this particular action, he's now commanding a regiment of Panzer Grenadiers. So, in a nutshell, the 21st Panzer Division will have 2 regiments of motorized infantry, Panzer Grenadiers, and 1 regiment of tanks. And they are all in the vicinity, ready to go. Only the order never comes for them to move until, as Luck claims, much to his frustration, until it's too late. Nevertheless, there is a counterattack on the bridge, and it takes place relatively quickly. And crucially, it takes place before the 7th Para arrive. So it's going to be the job of those guys who've got there, that's the Ox and Bucks Light Infantry and some of the airborne sappers, to protect the bridge. And once again, this man who we've got on the screen here plays an absolutely crucial role in this. So the first counterattack is by German armoured vehicles of Panzerjäger Battalion 716. This is a local battalion, it's not part of the 21st Panzer Division. 3 armoured vehicles, looking something like that. I mean, they're half-tracks, armoured half-tracks, are now lumbering towards the bridge from the direction of Ben Neuville. So they're coming from the west, and they're heading towards the entrance to the bridge, and lining the road, of course, are some of the Ox and Bucks, including our friend Wagger Thornton, who is holding the only serviceable pier. So they basically, as you can imagine, are relatively lightly armed. They've got Bren guns, they've got Sten guns, they've got Lee Enfield rifles, they've got grenades, but the only thing that they've got to use against armour is the pier. And the problem with the pier it needs to be used at very close range, and it's very slow to reload, and you have to stand up to reload it. So Wagger Thornton's lying on the road as he hear the rumble of the tracks. Remember, this is night time, all incredibly disorientating. You can hear the rumble of the tracks, and he thinks a tank's heading his way. In fact, I think it's Thornton who insists that this was a Panzer IV heading towards him. It definitely wasn't. But it doesn't matter. It's still a formidable bit of kit that is going to be able to blast the Ox and Bucks from their defensive positions if it's not stopped. And Wagger Thornton knows he's got a single shot, basically. Let's have a little look at we're moving on too fast here. Here's the pit. He's got a single shot, and he describes himself as shaking like a leaf afterwards, because he knew that the whole thing was on him. He waits until it's within 50 yards, 40 yards, 30 yards, and then he pulls the trigger. And fortunately for him, he hears a double explosion. The initial strike on the lead vehicle, and then a secondary explosion in which probably its ammunition went up. And this is great news for a couple of reasons. One of them is that the company commander of the German company, the Panzerjäger company, is on board that lead vehicle, and he gets killed, as indeed all the occupants do. And the second and even more important factor is that so severe is the explosion that it makes the two guys in the other armoured vehicles think there's probably a 6-pounder anti-tank gun there, or something heavier. Now, they didn't have any anti-tank guns at the bridges at this time. They're going to come in towards the end of D-Day with all the other glider-borne troops, but they don't have any heavy equipment at this stage. So it's all on this single pier. It's made a strike, very fortunately blown this thing to smithereens, and the other two vehicles, who could have just kept advancing, turn around and withdraw, and let, again unusually for the Germans, discretion be the better part of valor. So they've now got a crucial window to give 7 Para time to arrive. Let's have a look at the wonderfully named Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Pine Coffin, commanding 7 Para.
Thank you.
He, as I mentioned before, was a veteran of the North African fighting. He commanded 3 Para in a drop at Bone airfield, and then fights incredibly effectively thereafter. He's been moved across the 6th Airborne Division. It's very fortunate that he was. But as I also mentioned, he's only got 150 of his guys with him. Okay, but he marches very quickly with them to the bridges, and one of his officers is this man, Lieutenant Richard Todd. He's actually his assistant adjutant. There's a wonderful account written by Todd of the experience of being dropped by parachute on D-Day in the dark. There's also a wonderful account of his description of the Padre, George Parry, speaking to them the day before, and the final kind of pep talk before they go into action. All very moving. And remember, none of these guys, obviously some of the veterans, Pine Coffin aside, have seen action before. So everybody's wondering how they're actually going to cope. When they finally get into action, well, they get across the bridge, they deploy very quickly. So they move across both bridges, across the Orne River Bridge, then the Caen Canal Bridge, and then they deploy in defensive positions in Berneuville and also in a couple of other settlements a little bit to the north, and they await what they know is going to be an inevitable German counterattack. Well, if that counterattack, as it was put in, had taken place an hour or two earlier, everything could have been very different, but fortunately it was not. And it was actually left to the initiative of the local regimental commander who orders the attack to be put in, as opposed to the divisional commander of 21st Panzer Division, who wasn't even present that day. I mean, so there's a kind of issue with the chain of command. I think it's well known that Rommel's not at home commanding Army Group B, which is the whole sort of defensive layer in this part of the north of the Channel coast. So the attack is now put in by a Panzer Grenadier regiment, and it's a very brutal attack. And what you get in the story of the defense of the bridges is this kind of crucial moment between about 4 o'clock when the attack starts to about 8 or 9 o'clock when the fighting is at its most savage. And yet, as I mentioned before, airborne troops are incredibly formidable, even in a defensive position. And even though they're outnumbered, and they're certainly outgunned, they hold on to their positions at great cost, I might add, because A Company is basically shot to pieces. A Company is holding Berneuville. Also in Berneuville is, I'm not quite sure where they sighted it there, but they did, the regimental aid post. and the regimental aid post is overrun by these Panzer Grenadiers, who then murder everyone inside the regimental aid post, including George Parry, the chaplain. Parry's brother, interestingly enough, was a major in 9th Parachute Battalion, and he will come into the story of Nerval shortly after. I think I've got a picture of Parry. Oh, there's the gravestone project, George Parry. Well, you can imagine this infuriates his comrades, and yet, nevertheless, even though the whole of aid company has been pretty much wiped out, the regimental aid post has been destroyed. They do still hang on to their positions, and by the midday of the 6th of June, D-Day, something quite remarkable happens. They're clinging on. The Ox and Bucks are now intermingled with 7 Para in these defensive positions. They were intended to just hand over their positions, but they're actually brought back into the line, and they hear the rather wonderful sound of bagpipes. And so this is a true story. Some of you will have seen The Longest Day, and there's a moment in that with the skirling of the bagpipes and the arrival of the commanders, and that's exactly what happened. There is a twist to the story, which I'll come on to in a second, but the plan was for the 1st Commando Brigade, led by Lord Lovat, hence the bagpipes, was to get from the beaches as quickly as possible. They land late, of course, everything's late, and they get to the bridges late. They're at least a couple of hours late, but they get there nevertheless. And as a psychological moment, it's absolutely crucial. There's been this brutal fighting going on for most of the hours of darkness in the early morning, and now by midday, there's the psychological, because just think of the psychological element of being an airborne soldier. You're basically dropped in the middle of nowhere. It's all incredibly disorientating. You've never seen action before. There's enemy all around, and you don't know when or if you're going to be relieved. So to actually have contact with troops who actually landed at D-Day and know, insofar as your part of the theatre is concerned, it's going reasonably well. It's just a tremendous moment for all of them. The irony of this so-called relief of the bridges by the commandos is that they never relieved the bridges and were never intended to. They just marched straight across both bridges, and they're then into the bridgehead, and their job is to defend the bridgehead, which is now being attacked by the other regiment, the 21st Panzer Division. So there is a brutal fight going on, and the outer perimeter, as it were. You've now got to think of the bridges as the inner perimeter. And so they're not relieved at all. And it's not until, and the fighting continues. In fact, one of the commanding officers of one of the 3 commandos that marches across the bridge after Lovat is shot and killed. So the fighting is still going on at the bridge. And they move on. The Ox and Bucks and the 7 Paras left to their own devices all the way through the afternoon when the fighting continues, although not as severe as it was. And then finally, at 9 o'clock in the evening, the 2nd Warwicks march in from the beaches and do finally relieve 7 Para and the Ox and Bucks. This is a great moment, of course, needless to say. The last people over the bridge are Pine Coffin. He finally leaves his position in the early hours of the 7th of June and hands over definitively to the British infantry. And they then go into a reserve. There's a sort of codicil to the story. It's very tragic, actually, because Howard, of course, who's immensely proud of what his men have done in this absolutely key role, is asked the following day to advance on and capture with the rest of his battalion, which has now landed by gliders in the evening of the 6th of June, to capture a village which the German 21st Panzer Division is occupied, called Escoville. And it's in that fight that his company is effectively destroyed. He takes 58 casualties. He's shot through the helmet, or at least the side of the helmet, and concussed, almost killed. I mean, very, very fortunate. And he's eventually taken out of the line, sent back to England. He never sees action again. It's extraordinary, really. This was his one bit of action. He gets very badly injured in a car crash later that year, and that's effectively his military career. I mentioned before, though, didn't I, the other key story, and that's Merville. Let's have a little look at the time. Time's getting on a bit, so I won't go into this in any huge detail, but it is another extraordinary story, and of course, people have written books about it, and I could give a single lecture about it. But here's the key character in the story, Otway. He didn't come from the same sort of modest background as Howard, but he was very much in the same stamp in the way that he drove his men. He was actually second in command of 9 Para until just before D-Day, and very fortunately, I think his commanding officer is sacked and Otway's put in his place because he was a thruster, shall we say. Also devised a very clever plan, but in some ways overcomplicated in my view when I look at the detail of the plan. And any of you can go to the National Archives and look at the original planning documents and the intelligence and everything else, and it is fascinating. You see the aerial photographs and the way they pieced together the plan, but it was ludicrously complicated. I'm just going to show you a couple of other pictures. So this is what they're up against. This is one of the 4 emplacements, and probably even better to get a sense of scale. Here's the whole battery. They've got to break. It's 400 yards wide, circumference. Sorry. And it's incredibly heavily entrenched. I mean, it's got barbed wire, minefields, machine gun emplacements. Pretty much all the defending troops are behind concrete, and you've got to attack this and knock out all the guns with a battalion of 600 men. Only you're not going to have 600 men, are you? Because as I already explained, you're very lucky to get a fraction of that, and that's exactly what happened. So, as with 7 para, 9 para are blown all over the place. And Otway ends up at his rendezvous point with, again, about 150. He then turns to his back. Now, the plan, as I said, was very complicated. Each one had a separate job. They even had gliders that were supposed to, let's have a little look here. They even had gliders that were intended to actually land inside the defensive perimeter, which makes a lot of sense, but it's easier said than done. And not a single glider manages to do that. One of them lands somewhere around here. I'm not sure it's on the map. Yeah, so one of the gliders lands there, and then they're taken out by some Germans in the vicinity, and they don't really play a role. Now, the problem with losing the gliders is all the sappers are on board, and the sappers' job is to knock out the guns. So now you've got Otway thinking, okay, we're going to knock out the guns, but we've only got 150, and everyone had a job, and we were going to blow up this, and we were going to use torpedoes, we were going to use explosives to work our way through the defensive positions, and we had enough men with covering fire, and you can imagine it was a ridiculously complicated plan. And now he's only got 1 man for every 4 jobs, and they haven't been trained in every single role. So he has to think, he has to kind of adapt on the hoof. And while he's thinking this is absolute madness, this is total suicide, he turns to his batman and he says, "What do you think? What should we do?" Rhetorical question, obviously, and the batman says, as you would expect, "Well, why are you asking me that question? You know what you've got to do, which is give it a go and die in the attempt." And that's exactly what they do. Only they pull it off. Astonishing story. It was, read the divisional report, a disappointment to the battalion to find that the guns were of 75mm caliber only, and these were destroyed by gammon bombs. It does not detract, however, from a magnificent feat of arms and a display of absolute determination to overcome all odds. Again, his force was badly cut up, just like 7 para was, as you can imagine. A lot of wounded, a lot of killed, but they do manage to break their way in there, and they overwhelm the garrison, and they capture the guns, and they try relatively ineffectively, as it turns out, mainly because they don't have any sappers with them, to destroy the guns. And there are some German sources that say they actually got the guns into action the following day. But in this crucial window, when of course the troops are coming into the beaches at the initial landings, these guns are out of action. They probably were, they say in divisional report they're only 75mm, they were probably 105mm. Let's not split hairs, they're still going to cause a problem to the beaches and the ships coming in. Astonishing piece of heroism, really, to capture this. In some ways, although the job wasn't quite as important as the capture of the bridges, and the bridges has maybe overshadowed what was done there, this feat, I think, in terms of the difficulty and the courage that was required was, without parallel. There's the 1st Commando Brigade landing. Obviously, that's before they finally get through. Here's a quick quote from Private Dennis Edwards from somewhere to the north, well beyond the churchyard and probably beyond the village. I heard a sound that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, a sound like the wild wailing of banshees. One of the lads shouted, "It's them, it's the commando." We all let out a cheer as the noise grew louder, and we recognized it as the high-pitched and uneven wailing of bagpipes. So I told you that story before. the codicil to the story is not just for Howard, but for the whole of the 6th Airborne Division, I think, one of tragedy and a great shame, because its job was to do what it did, and it did it incredibly effectively. Its job was to guard the flank of the beachhead for those first 2 or 3, maybe the first week, you would say, is an absolutely crucial role. But they, as they so often did, they keep them there fighting as infantry for the next 6 weeks or so, and that's when the gradual attrition of these incredibly highly trained, aggressive, effective, fit young men are taken a toll of. So that by the end of the fighting, I'll just read out a quick statistic to give you a sense of what actually happened to them by the end. On the page, it says well, in a nutshell, 4,500 casualties, about 800 killed, the rest wounded, missing. It was, a tragedy, frankly, that they were left in the line so long. All the commanders who had command of them were delighted to have them there. I mean, needless to say, they finally lead the breakout, which takes place in August, of course, when they're finally on the move again. They get all the way, almost all the way to the River Seine before they're finally pulled out of the line in early September. And yet, of course, the story of Airborne Division D-Day is not really the story of Airborne Division. In Normandy, it's that crucial 24 hours, 36 hours, whatever you want to call it, right at the beginning, in which they have these crucial tasks and they pull them off. What would have happened if they failed? Well, if the Germans had been able to counterattack the flank of the beachhead, it could have been a disaster. We'll never know, of course, but they do pull it off. They carry out their job. And it's for that actions that the 6th Airborne Division will forever be remembered. It is doubtful, noted a British newspaper report of the 22nd of June, whether there's ever been a body of troops brought to a higher pitch of physical fitness, self-reliance and fighting skill. The gallant deeds of that magnificent division made history. As General Montgomery said yesterday, the men of that division who died did not die in vain. Thank you. So questions, and feel free to to range more widely than just the story of D-Day. Yes.
You talked about the invaluable intelligence that came from the resistance before the operation. How much of a heads up did the resistance get of Overlord, or was it so secret that they just didn't know? And on the back of that, was there any support from the resistance from a military point of view in terms of sabotage and demolition while this action was taking place?
To the invaders generally, or to the airborne.
I'm thinking specifically about this first spearhead.
Well, first part of your question, operational security was vital. Hardly anyone knew about D-Day, is the truth of the matter. They're certainly not going to be telling the members of the French resistance. They may have guessed. Everybody knew an invasion was coming. They didn't know where it was coming. Of course, if you were, a member of the Gondry family who weren't members of the resistance, and they were being asked to provide vital information about this bridge, I'm sure they would put 2 and 2 together. The deception plans, of course, were very effective right up until days into the Normandy operation. The Germans still held troops back, thinking that this was just an initial feint and the main landings were going to be in the Pas-de-Calais. So the answer to the first question is no one knew exactly what was going on as far as the D-Day landings were concerned. The second part of the question is interesting. I mean, the SAS and various other units, Jedburgh, small teams, were dropped to coordinate the French resistance. Their main task was well away from the beaches, of course. Their main task was to interdict the German reinforcements coming the other way. And they did it pretty well, actually. I mean, that wasn't the only thing that was done. Very effectively, of course, they're bombing all the marshalling yards and at great cost to French civilians. I mean, Churchill has to be absolutely, with his arm twisted up his back, agree to that operation, which Eisenhower insisted on, and that is to use the heavy bombing force to destroy French communications. And of course, a lot of French died. How many? I'm not quite sure. 20,000, they estimate, I think. 20,000 French civilians were killed in that. But, generally speaking, people, even Frenchmen, including de Gaulle, saw it as a necessary evil. But some of the coordination of the resistance was very effective, actually, with the SAS, and they do, cause a lot of chaos, basically. The other big factor, of course, preventing the counterattack of the beaches was control of the air. And this is probably the single most important factor, because the various Panzer divisions, including SS, that were then very rapidly heading for the beachhead, can only move at night, and they are having a very heavy toll taken of them by fighter bombers, rocket firing typhoons, and everything else. So I think command of the air is the real key thing, but of course everyone's playing a part, and the resistance did play a part. Yeah.
Saul, I'm assuming when the Airborne was set up and you had those original 500 soldiers, there was pretty much all volunteering. But was there any selection process put in place to get to that 500, or was it like just first come, first served?
Well, the original 500 were sort of just grabbed, but they took anyone who was ballsy enough to volunteer for what would be dangerous duty. No one was making any bones about what they were expected to do. And if you think about it, Trevor, a lot of people, including a lot of the early volunteers for the Airborne Force, had never been in a plane, let alone jump out of it. So it's so counterintuitive, really, isn't it? The idea that you're going to agree to go into war by a means of transport you've got no understanding of. You're aware of planes, obviously, but you've got no understanding of it. That takes a particular type of character. So my first point I'm trying to make is that people even prepared to volunteer are pretty gung-ho, pretty devil-may-care. And then there was the weeding out process as they trained, particularly the willingness to actually undertake the jumps. If you refused one jump, that was it, you were out. It was one strike and out. Of course, it was incredibly physical training. They were trained to be able to march long distances, to be able to effectively operate in a hostile environment for long periods of time. So they were looking for, I'm not saying they were very sophisticated in their identification methods to begin with, but ultimately they're looking for the right type of people who can act semi-independently. They're still fighting as an organized unit. They've still got their guys on either side of them in most cases, but they're also, it's a very strange psychological environment, really, isn't it, fighting as an airborne soldier in the Second World War. You're going to be dropped in the middle of nowhere, it's nighttime, it's incredibly disorientating. Nobody really knows how they're going to react. So you're trying to make sure you've got the right people through the training. To finish off, a lot of people went back to their units, were returned to their units. So the fallout rate was quite high. That's the initial creation of, shall we call it the 1st Parachute Brigade. As the Airborne Forces expanded, they took whole units and adapted them. That's not to say that, for example, the Essex, I can't remember who they were, but it was a battalion of the Essex Regiment that becomes the 9th Parachute Battalion. Now, what would almost certainly have happened is, so they say, okay guys, we're becoming airborne, who's up for it? And let's say 400 would have put their hands up, and probably only 200 of those would have survived the training. And then you've got volunteers coming in on top of that. So it's a bit of a mishmash, really, in the end, as to who ended up in Airborne. But certainly by 1944, when the 1st Airborne Division fight at Arnhem, they pretty much worked out the right sort of people. And you can see from the way they fight at Arnhem, with one or two very, very rare exceptions where I think it's the general commanding points out a couple of instances during the defense of the Oosterbeek perimeter where people break and run, and he's like, what the hell is going on here? But that is very, very rare, and you can see how stoical they are in the fighting of the bridge, and they pretty much got the right sort of people by that point who are going to fight tooth and nail for as long as it takes. Yep.
You described very graphically the man with the one pierce, and the fact that the Germans turned around and retreated.
Yeah.
How long did they sit there with just one pierce against possible German mechanized attack?
Well, the 7 Para brought in more kit with them, but they didn't ever have any anti-tank guns. During the crucial period of fighting, that I was describing. So pretty much from the moment that so they have more piers later on in the day, because 7 Para bring in a few with them, but they don't have many themselves, of course, because they don't have all their kit either. It's not until the evening, George, as I mentioned, when the rest of the air landing brigade comes in by glider, that they begin to get some heavier equipment, and they have proper anti-tank guns. Yeah. So it's a bit of a wing and a prayer, really, and looks right. The German Panzer commander's right. If the order had been given to advance with all 3 regiments, particularly the Panzer regiment, of obviously heavier armour, medium to heavy armour, there would have been a serious problem. But they don't, and you've got to, it's all about speed, as I mentioned before, speed in taking the bridges, but speed in taking them back as well from the German behalf. And these hours are the crucial moments, really. If they'd had a chance to, if they hadn't been deterred by that single pier, for example, where were the other piers? Well, they'd all got damaged in the landing, actually. So they didn't arrive with only 1 pier, but all the other piers were knocked out of commission because they got damaged in the landing, which just again emphasises the sort of shock experience of landing in a glider.
He could reload it, could he?
He could reload it, and he did reload it. But of course, if those 2 armoured vehicles had kept coming, half tracks had kept coming, he wouldn't have had time to reload it. He'd also have had to stand up. You couldn't reload it lying down. Well, unless there's someone in this room who's got experience of loading a pier, but apparently it was very difficult to load lying down. So there are lots of those lovely moments, really, where it's a lot of fortune comes into the story, but that's fairly typical, I think. Yeah, okay.
Those bridges were capable of being lifted to allow shipping to go through. Why didn't they lift them to prevent the Germans crossing them? And secondly, when the dawn came up, why weren't the fighter bombers attacking the armoured units who were approaching the bridges?
Yeah, it's interesting. The Panzer Regiment does eventually go into action, doesn't it? Later, later in the day on the 6th of June, and it was attacked by air. But what you've got, if you think about the map, as it were, you've got a very confused situation in which you've got airborne troops, you've got commandos and other infantry moving up from the beach. Basically, the planes are not going to know who's enemy and who isn't. Yes, it may be obvious when you see a column of German panzers, possibly, but I think that was part of the problem, that the air is not being used to plaster the ground, and indeed the ships aren't really firing into all these locations because there's a mixture of Allied and German troops. The Germans certainly had an opportunity to concentrate their Panzer Division. This 21st Panzer Division is interesting. It was a veteran of the North African campaign, and that's not to say everyone in it had been in North Africa, but von Luck had. And it was a very effective fighting organisation. And Luck's point, as I've already made, is we needed to go immediately. He knew within probably 10 minutes of the first paratroopers coming down, not so much the gliders, but the paratroopers coming down, that there was an airborne attack, and that's when he requested permission to move, and it wasn't given.
So you didn't have the autonomy to do it yourself?
Oh, sorry, at the bridge, yeah. I don't know, there's a very good point about the bridge. They never, their relief is coming from the other side of the bridge, okay? So they don't want to raise the bridge because the commandos have got to come across the bridge, and so have the infantry after them. So a little bit like the Germans, you want to keep the bridge intact as long as you can hold it. So it's a judgment call, isn't it? And if, for example, Howard had thought we're not going to be able to hold on to the bridge, let's raise it. Arguably, he could have done that, but in no way in his writing about the bridge, that's writing afterwards and also in his after-action report, does he ever say he considered doing that. Whether they sort of technically knew how to do it and how long it would take also isn't discussed. But no, it doesn't seem that they ever did consider doing
They weren't trained to do it.
I mean, I suspect they probably had considered the possibility that they might need to do it as a method of last resort. But I don't know. Have we got any engineers in this room who might be able to explain how long it would take to raise a bridge of that type? I don't know. Any other questions? Yeah.
I was just going to say, having watched it go up, the modern bridge, it's 2 or 3 minutes.
Oh, it's 2 or 3 minutes, is it? The modern one? Okay.
The lights go off and then the bridge goes up, 2 or 3 minutes, the yacht comes past. 2 or 3 minutes later, back down again, cars going across.
Yeah, so it's still operating at the same role. I mean, obviously the system that they're doing it with will be slightly different now, won't it? Hence the kind of water tank. But in any case, yeah. So yeah, 2 or 3 minutes maybe. But in the middle of a battle, I don't think anyone wants to show themselves enough to, to be able to operate the gear. It's probably another factor. There's a question here.
You very vividly describe how they landed, and it was at night,
Yeah.
and how closely it was planned. To what degree was there any sort of communication with a sort of central control, commanders above them, or have they just got a mission, they know what that is, and they hope it works and they hope the other bits start? Is there any chance in those circumstances to be given direction beyond what they're already doing, or is that just not really happening?
Well, there was. I mean, the plan is to fully integrate the command as it arrives. So the divisional commander, who I haven't even mentioned, but is one of the wonderful characters in the story of Airborne, Richard Windy Gale, as he was known. He should have been commanding at Arnhem, not Urquhart, who was commanding. Because Gale had been in Airborne from the start, and he understood Airborne. He was the original commander of the 1st Parachute Brigade. He lands with, I think he lands by glider actually, rather than parachute. Poet lands, so the Parachute Brigade commanders land by parachute. The divisional commander lands by glider. Now, they all have a radio net that is supposed to be set up. The problem is, a bit like Arnhem, not quite as bad as Arnhem. It doesn't work that effectively. Poet loses his radio operator for starters. Gale is in communication with a lot of what else is going on, but basically all of these individual jobs have to happen by remote control. That's why they're all planned by the officers concerned. I mean, Otway's given the job of capturing because he's going to be the man on the spot, and exactly the same with Howard at the bridge. So while in an ideal world they are going to be under overall, direction within, let's say 4 or 5 hours of landing, in reality they're going to be left on their Todd for a lot longer than that. Poet actually gets to the bridge reasonably quickly, so that's Poet, the brigade commander who's missing his radio operator, says everything okay? Yeah, everything's okay, and he buggers off again to take control of his whole brigade, which is in defensive positions in the airborne bridgehead. So actually senior commanders, no, I mean the battalion commander of course turns up, and that's Pine Coffin, but that's really the chain of command that how it has to deal with for most of the crucial first day in France. Any other questions?
Well, it's just an observation that from the German side, there was considerable confusion of what the hell was going on, wasn't there? Not all the commanders were there
Yeah.
for various reasons. And therefore it's hardly surprising it's going to take them time to get themselves sorted out with the right troops in the right place.
Yes, I mean, I go into this a little bit in the book, in which there's a debate about what standing orders were there. I mean, what they seem to have done is put in place a kind of halfway house system. So basically, in a nutshell, Hitler was over-interfering, saying, I'll order the strategic reserve into action when the time comes. Now, Rommel already knew what an idiot Hitler was by this point. So he had insisted that at least some of the armoured forces work close to the beaches, hence the 21st Panzer Division. There was another one not that far away. But they had orders, in theory, standing orders, to counteract any landing force, both by sea and air, immediately. In theory, in reality, they had to have the say-so from higher command. And in the case of Rommel, of course, it's Army Group B, and then it went down to Army Command, and then it went down to Divisional Command, Corps Command, and then Divisional Command. So in actual fact, you had this tortuous chain of command. Despite all of that, what you did see at D-Day in many occasions, not just with Airborne, is individual German commanders making their own decisions, which of course they were very good at, which is why the British Army years later kind of takes a lead from the Germans, doesn't it, and says, okay, well, you don't always have the command structure in place, therefore people have got to use their initiative. And that's what happens. I think Luck's fury is not so much that the relevant orders didn't come all the way down from Rommel, is that divisional staff didn't take that initiative. Now, as I think I mentioned, or someone also reminded us,
the divisional commander of the 21st Panzer Division isn't present at the start of the battle. But his staff, of course, are all in place. So someone's, operations have got to take a decision, haven't they? And they don't, because they don't want to get into trouble until it's too late. Yeah.
I was going to mention that fortitude, because the German High Command at this point knew that the proper invasion was going to come to part of Calais.
Yeah.
Normally it was just a feint, so the last thing.
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, it doesn't, while you're absolutely right, and that is the reason why they're not sending everything to Normandy, and therefore, the job done, as it were, as far as fortitude is concerned. It doesn't explain why the individual commanders, such as they were in the vicinity, aren't acting with more aggression. Now, some were, actually, but this vital bit of kit that they had there, this veteran formation, 21st Panzer Division, that's their opportunity to cause serious trouble at the beginning of the campaign. Now, very quickly, it is fascinating what happens with Rommel next, actually, because I've been reading up on this, partly because I've just done a podcast on it, but partly because I'm eventually going to write about this in my next book. And it's fascinating, his mindset at the beginning of this campaign. There's a dichotomy between him doing his professional duty, as you would expect a German soldier to do, and hoping that, he still had this hopelessly naive idea that if they could somehow come to terms with the Western Allies, then they could turn all their forces on the east, and he wasn't the only one thinking that. But that is absolutely at the basis of his, how can you put it, his sort of semi-treasonous actions. Now, the great debate is whether or not he knew about the bomb plot, which takes place only a few weeks later. And I would say the evidence indicates that he knew that it was in the offing. Was he ever told about the actual date, and was he party to it, and did he agree to it? Almost certainly not. So he wanted to see the end of the war in the West, because he saw the Soviets, understandably, as a bigger threat. But he did not want to have Hitler's blood on his hands, not least because he'd been relatively close to Hitler. He commanded his escort battalion, and also the FHQ, the Führer headquarters, in the Low Countries in the Polish campaign, and also I think in the advance into Czechoslovakia. So he didn't want to have Hitler's blood on his hands, but he did want to see the back of Hitler. And you get this really interesting meeting. I think it's about the 9th of. Well, you get two meetings. First of all, Hitler goes to see. I'm getting off the beat track here, but just stay with me for a sec. Hitler goes to to stiffen the defences, so to speak, or to stiffen morale, and he goes to meet von Rundstedt, who's still commanding in the West, and Rommel. And Rommel tells him in no uncertain terms, we can't hold on in Normandy. I mean, we're going to need to withdraw, and the sooner we do it, the better. He was saying the same thing in North Africa, and that went down very badly, and of course it goes down very badly, but probably that discussion in which Hitler says absolutely not is the final straw, I think, for Rommel. Does it matter that he knew of the bomb plot in all its details? Not really. I mean, his deputy, his chief of staff, Spiedel, certainly did. And so did, of course, Stulpnagel, who's commanding the Paris garrison. So it's very, very senior people in key roles, all of whom were very close to Rommel, knew. So, you could say it's unlikely he didn't know. But then you get this extraordinary moment where they decide what to do with Rommel, and they actually effectively frame him with evidence that's probably fabricated, which is that someone said you knew exactly what was going on. Not necessarily the case, but he knew what he'd done was treasonous, which probably made it slightly easier for him to accept, there's no way out of this. Better to commit suicide and let my family off the hook than, risk a trial in which they may well. He thought he wouldn't get to Berlin. He thought he's going to be bumped off on the way. Who knows what would have happened? He was a national hero, of course. That's the problem for Hitler. He couldn't just easily bump off Rommel in the way that he could some of these other commanders. Getting off the beaten track here. Sorry about that. Any more questions before we break? Yeah, we've got a little bit of time. Yeah.
So you talked earlier about one of the commanders going off to take control.
Yeah.
You've got no radio yet, so how did they take control of that?
Yeah, physically,
something like that.
Literally,
This
we're
is
moving
driving between positions.
But the other thing, if you think about it, so the brigadier's got his brigade net. He's got his slightly more powerful radio, as we know from the Arnhem story. I mean, if his kit goes astray, which it did, then he needs to get someone else's kit. I mean, he needs to get onto someone else's neck, which is exactly what happens. I mean, Poet gets around the problem of not being able to communicate by radio by physically turning up at places. I mean, it was that, which makes complete sense. There's a moment, I think, where both Poet, I think it's Kindersley, who's commanding the 6th Air Landing Brigade, both are at the bridges at the same time, and that gives you a sense of how important the capture of those bridges were. They both go and have a look. This is in the early hours of the 6th of June, before the fighting's really got as fierce as it becomes a few hours later as 21st Panzer Division attacks. So yeah, they're on their feet, and then as soon as they get to a working radio, they're probably sending messages and doing it that way. But to think that it was properly, there was an effective command structure in the early hours of D-Day, I mean, absolutely not. I mean, all of these individual actions were going on independently almost.
Just an observation more than a question. You were talking fairly early on about targets, why the British were on the eastern side, why the Americans. And I was interested to reading Chief of Staff reports from through 43 at the same time as the Cossack team were putting the plan together for what was it, Operation Rudge, wasn't it, up until June 43, and then they changed it to Overlord.
Yeah.
And they decided then that we would have the northern Ruhr and what have you as an occupation zone, and that the Americans, obviously the French were.
Ah, that's interesting. So the geography of the landing at D-Day.
So then the British had to be in the Kent and Sussex area to go down onto that side. They actually had the, was it Gold Beach, was the Weestrum, the completely eastern one?
Yeah,
No,
Sword was the extra beach added.
Because Force S was based up in Scotland to support fortitude north for the invasion of Norway. And they were brought down in May to prepare for the Force S landings at Weestrum. The Americans were based in the west of the country, so you've got all of their airborne forces over in Devon and Cornwall and all that kind of stuff. And that was all set, cast in stone by October, November 43. And in December, the Americans, just in one meeting, just before one of the conferences, tell you what, we'll have the north and the British can have the south. And the Cossack team were gobsmacked because they said, do you realise what's going to happen for us to reverse all the targets in Normandy, because that's where they obviously need a really landing, and all the way through France. And they spent 3 weeks looking at logistics. And so we can't do it. We also can't cross the armies while we're going through France.
It's an interesting point you're making there. So if you think of the way they're going to wheel out of Normandy,
absolutely.
So that does make sense that they would have the British at that eastern side of the.
They nearly got to the point where they said, right, what we'll do once the fighting's finished and we've got our occupation zones, then we'll transfer the armies, the Americans from the south and the British from the north, and cross over. They reckon that's going to take 3 to 4 months. And huge logistical problem. And they finally compromised by giving the Americans Bremen as a standalone little port in the north. And the targets stayed as they were, and Morgan and the Cossack team went, phew, we don't have to change it. So that's what they got the targets.
Yeah, very interesting. No, that is interesting. And yet, nevertheless, if 6th Airborne Division was relatively inexperienced, bar some its veteran officers, well, it was very inexperienced, bar its veteran officers. Of course, so too with the Americans. They had a little bit of experience in North Africa and also Italy, but hardly anything, and certainly not landing in this kind of strategic role for which they did it the first time in D-Day. And things do go a bit astray for the Americans, of course, on D-Day, as of course they do for everyone, all the airborne forces there. It was the right decision to put the Brits that side. I mean, there may have been that additional factor, as you've explained. It's an interesting point. But certainly this key role of protecting the east side, it made sense that it was given to the Brits. Any more questions before we break?
Just maybe I talked to you briefly about it last time, you could read it. Recent book suggested that one of the reasons why Arnie went tits up was that Anthony Blunt had leaked it to the Germans, that the Russians wanted to hold up the British forces.
Yeah. Yeah, the problem with that argument by Verkade is that there's absolutely no indication from any of the German sources that they were under, that they were anything other than completely taken by surprise. So if they'd been told in advance, for whatever reason, by whomever, you would have seen some kind of planning that
But
would
there's
have been.
Dutchmen involved too, wasn't there?
Well, funny enough, I haven't read the book, but honestly, I mean, having looked at all the sources, I can't see any indication that the Germans were aware that they were coming, and there's every indication that they were completely taken by surprise. Their reaction, of course, was pretty impressive. You know, in many ways, a lot more impressive than it was at D-Day. You know, in the way that I've described, you know, the slowness of the 21st Panzer Division. Well, the two SS Panzer Divisions are put into action very quickly, and those individual commanders on the ground between the landing zone at Arnhem and the city set up blocking lines. They know exactly what's going on immediately, literally within minutes of the parachutes coming down and the gliders coming down. So, but that they were all both, you know, in the way that they behaved, but also in their accounts written afterwards, completely surprised by the arrival of the airborne forces. I don't think there's any doubt. But it, you know, it makes for a good book, of course, if you can try and say something new about it. Why not?
Just one little thing to add to that. Again, it's the Chief of Staff's memos. You can tell I've been reading a lot of them. On the 8th of September, they would charge the Joint Intelligence Committee and the Combined Chiefs of Staff, since the American and British, were asked to prepare the likelihood of a German collapse in readiness for the Quebec conference, which was just about to take place.
Yeah, yeah.
So they spent 2 weeks looking at all the returns coming to the front. They just watched the Germans collapse in France and move north. And they said absolutely categorically that the German army underneath OKW and OKH, so the army and Wehrmacht, so this is excluding the SS,
Yeah.
would have collapsed and would not be functional from the 1st of December onwards. So there's 6 weeks left of the German army.
Yeah, that mindset, which was inaccurate, of course, but that mindset is the reason they were prepared to take the risks they were at Arnhem, because they in effect felt. I mean, Browning, I think it goes on the record as saying, this is. He says to some members of his staff, "This is like 1918." I think it's Brian Urquhart, isn't it, who of course is his chief of intelligence, who basically blows the whistle afterwards and says, "What were we thinking? We knew there were Panzer troops in the area." But Urquhart also reports that Browning had said to him at one point, "This is another 1918. They're collapsing." In which case, you can take risks in that situation. You can try and, you know, end the war 6 months earlier. Which is why, in the end, for all the errors that were made at Arnhem, I still, you know, my personal belief was it's still a risk worth taking, because it would have had extraordinary results. And they weren't a million miles away from pulling it off, even with the endless balls ups, both in planning and in execution. Okay, we'll break there. Thank you guys.